Quang's phone goes dead in the rain, leaving Linda alone at the stone house, wondering if she'll ever hear his footsteps at the gate again. Hello, everyone. I hope you have a wonderful day. Today, we're going to explore a quiet, emotional moment as Linda waits through the storm, gets hurt trying to manage alone, and Quang rushes home to make sure she and the baby are safe. If you enjoy this story, don't forget to subscribe so you won't miss the next videos. The stone house always sounded different when Quang wasn't in it. In the morning, before he left, the rooms had been full of soft movement. His footsteps on the cool floor, the quiet clink of a mug in the sink, the low murmur of his voice as he checked his phone. He'd stood behind Linda while she rinsed rice, his hands resting on her waist for a moment, not to pull her close, just to remind her he was there. "I'll be back before sunset," he said. Linda turned her head and looked up at him. His hair was still damp from a quick shower, his shirt plain, but he carried that calm control people saw at meetings and job sites. At home, it was gentler. He kissed her forehead like he was sealing the promise. "Don't work too hard," he added. "I'm going to water plants," she said, amused. "The plants don't file complaints." Quang's mouth curved, then his gaze drifted to the bassinet near the window. Their baby slept, cheeks round, one tiny fist curled under the chin. Quang lowered his voice. "If you need me, call, even for something small." "I will," Linda said. "Go." He hesitated like he wanted to say more, then nodded once and slipped out. The gate creaked and clicked shut. The sound traveled across the courtyard, and then the house settled into a quiet that felt bigger than it should have. Linda moved through her routine on purpose. Not fast, not slow, steady. She carried a small stool to the garden edge so she could sit when she needed to. The beds were neat, the soil dark from yesterday's watering. She loosened clumps with a hand tool, pulled a few stubborn weeds, and checked the tomatoes that were finally turning red. As she worked, she sang under her breath, a simple tune that kept her company. Every so often, she looked toward the road beyond the gate. It wasn't impatience. It was a habit, like touching your pocket to make sure your keys are still there. A faint cry rose from inside, brief and sharp. Linda wiped her hands on her pants and went in. The baby's eyes were barely open, mouth trembling with the start of a complaint. Linda leaned over and brushed a finger along the soft cheek. "Hey," she whispered, "I'm here." The baby quieted at the sound of her voice. Linda adjusted the blanket, made sure nothing covered the face, and watched the chest rise and fall until her own breathing matched it. Then she returned to the garden, lighter. By afternoon, she had a basket of greens, long beans, and 2 ripe tomatoes. She rinsed everything at the outdoor tap and carried it inside. The kitchen filled with practical smells, garlic, ginger, the clean bite of herbs. Rice steamed on the stove. Soup simmered in a pot that wouldn't need much attention. She set the table with 2 bowls even though it was still early, because she liked the way it looked when everything was ready. Her phone buzzed on the counter. Running late. Something came up. "I'm okay. Home soon." Linda stared at the words for a second, then let out the breath she hadn't realized she was holding. She typed back, "Okay, drive safe. Dinner's ready whenever you get here." A heart appeared almost immediately. Linda smiled, small and private, and went back to stirring the soup. The light changed not long after. Clouds gathered, heavy and quick, turning the courtyard gray at the edges. Wind pushed through the trees and made the laundry line sway. Linda looked out and saw the baby's blanket fluttering where she'd hung it to air. "All right," she murmured. She turned the stove down and stepped outside. The air smelled sharp, rain before rain. She pulled the blanket free, then the tiny onesie beside it. The first drops hit her forearm, then more. She gathered the last piece of laundry and hurried toward the door. The stone step had already darkened with water. Linda's foot slid. It was a fast, clean slip, her stomach dropping, her arms tightening around the bundle in her hands. She threw her shoulder into the door frame and caught herself before she went down. The laundry fell in a soft heap at her feet. For a moment, she just stood there, pressed to the wood, heart pounding too hard for such a small mistake. Pain flared in her wrist where it twisted, enough to sting, enough to make her blink. Inside, the baby made a small sound, like a question. "I'm okay," Linda whispered, mostly to herself. She crouched carefully, gathered the clothes with her good hand, and stepped inside. Rain hit the roof harder now, loud and steady. She went straight to the bassinet. The baby's face tightened, ready to cry. Linda lifted the small body and held the baby against her chest. The warmth grounded her. She walked slow circles in the kitchen, rocking in tiny steps until the baby softened and quieted. Her wrist throbbed when she shifted her grip. She tried not to show it. She set the baby back down and checked the breathing again, the way Quang always did when he worried. The baby was fine. That was one thing she could be sure of. Linda picked up her phone. She called Quang. It rang twice, then went to voicemail. She tried again. This time the call failed before it even rang. The screen flashed, then went still. Linda stared at it, the way you stare at a door that should open and doesn't. Quang didn't like being unreachable. He answered everything: calls, questions, emergencies. Even when he tried to be off, his phone was never far. A thought rose, unwanted and sharp. What if something happened? She pushed it down with a breath, the kind of breath Quang had coached her through when life felt too loud. In, out, slow. The soup continued to simmer. Rice steamed. The house smelled like dinner and clean rain. Ordinary things. Linda held onto them like a railing. She found the small first aid box Quang insisted on keeping stocked. She wrapped her wrist with a soft bandage, not too tight, just supportive. She flexed her fingers. They moved, pain but manageable. Then she made tea. It was a simple act, but it steadied her hands. She poured hot water into a cup and watched the steam rise. The rain blurred the courtyard beyond the window, turning the gate into a dark shape in a pale wash. Linda carried the tea to the table and sat where she could see the front door and the bassinet at the same time. She set the phone beside her, screen up, volume on. The baby made a small sighing sound. Linda leaned over, touched the baby's hand, and felt the tiny fingers curl around hers. "I'm right here," she said softly. "We're safe." She looked at the door again, then at the phone, and took a slow sip of tea. The rain kept falling. Inside the stone house, Linda kept the quiet together with one warm cup, a wrapped wrist, and the steady rise and fall of her baby's breathing. Linda kept her tea near her fingertips, as if warmth could keep her thoughts from wandering. Rain filled the courtyard with a steady hush, and the stone walls sent the sound back through the rooms. Her phone stayed quiet. She checked it once more, then left it face up on the table. The baby stirred in the bassinet, a small twist and a sleepy noise. Linda stood and leaned over, careful with her wrapped wrist, and rested her good hand on the baby's belly until the tiny body settled. "I'm here," she whispered. She turned the heat down under the soup and tried to focus on ordinary things. Dinner. Warmth. The next minute. Then the gate creaked. Relief came first, quick and automatic, and then caution followed behind it. Footsteps crossed the wet path, steady and familiar. A knock came at the door, light and careful. Linda looked through the small side window. Quang stood on the porch with rain darkening his shoulders and hair. He held a plastic bag in one hand and touched the doorframe with the other, like he didn't want to bring the outside in too fast. She opened the door. Quang stepped inside and closed it behind him. He took off his shoes, lined them by the mat, and lifted his eyes to her face. "I'm sorry," he said quietly. Linda watched him like her body needed proof he was really here. "You didn't call," she said. Simple. Quang pulled his phone from his pocket. The screen stayed black. He pressed the button, then exhaled. "It died. I thought it had enough. The meeting ran long, then the road was blocked. I kept thinking I'd be home in 10 minutes. His gaze dropped to her wrist. "What happened?" "I slipped on the step," Linda said. "I caught myself. Just twisted it." Quang moved closer and took her wrapped wrist between both palms without squeezing. His hands were cool from the rain. "Does it hurt?" "A little." His jaw tightened. He nodded once and turned toward the bassinet. The baby slept, mouth slightly open, one fist near the cheek. Quang bent, slid 2 fingers under the collar the way he always did, then let out a quiet breath. "Hey," he whispered. He washed his hands at the sink and came back to the stove. He didn't tell Linda to sit. He just started doing it, stirring the soup, warming the bowls, setting the table again like he was putting the room back into order. Linda sat, her good hand around the teacup, watching him plug in his phone. The screen finally lit, weak and late. "I'm keeping a power bank in the car," Quang said. "I called you," Linda replied. "Twice." Quang paused. "How long was I unreachable?" "I don't know," Linda said. "Long enough to notice." He set a bowl down carefully. "I'm sorry," he said again, and this time it sounded like he understood what the silence had done. They ate slowly. Quang moved the bowl closer when she reached the wrong way, slid the spoon toward her when it drifted. He didn't make a show of it. He just stayed attentive. The baby made a soft whimper. Quang stood, lifted the baby and held the small body against his chest. He rocked in short steps, the same rhythm he used at night. "It's okay," he murmured. "I'm here." The baby quieted. He lowered the baby back into the bassinet and returned to the table, not quite able to pick up his spoon. "I should have found a phone," he said. "Borrowed one. I was stuck and thinking like a fool, like getting home fast would fix it." Linda's voice stayed gentle. "You came as soon as you could." Quang's eyes went to her wrist again. "And you were here alone," he said. He pushed his chair back and crossed to the door. He opened it a crack and looked down at the darkened stone step, slick with rain. Without a word, he took a towel from the hook, knelt, and wiped the water away in slow strokes. He placed a small rubber mat where her foot had slipped, pressing the corners flat with his palm. Then he checked the gate latch and the porch light, making sure it clicked on with a steady glow. When he came back, his voice was quiet. "I don't want you running out there in weather like this," he said. "If something needs bringing in, we leave it. We buy another blanket. We don't risk you." Linda's eyes lowered. "I wasn't thinking," she admitted. "I know," Quang said. "That's why I have to." He reached into the bag and placed a wrist brace on the table, along with a small tube of cooling gel. Then he set down a packet of the tea Linda liked. "I stopped at the pharmacy," he said. "I asked what to get." Linda stared at the brace. "You didn't have to." "I did," Quang said, "because you would wrap it and keep going." He moved to her side and crouched. He unwrapped the bandage gently, checked for swelling, then fitted the brace around her wrist and adjusted the straps until it was snug. "Tell me if it's too tight," he said. "It's fine," Linda whispered. "Better." Quang stayed there a moment, one hand resting lightly on her knee. "I'm sorry you had to listen to the house by yourself," he said. Linda touched his cheek with her good hand. pale skin, damp hair, a real person. "You're home," she said. Quang leaned into her hand, then stood and cleared the table. He washed the dishes quietly. Linda sat with her tea, watching the simple motion of his arms, the way he wiped the counter after. When he finished, he came back and took her braced hand carefully between both of his. "From now on," Quang said, "if I'm late, I message you before the battery drops. If it drops, I borrow a phone. I don't care whose." Linda nodded, the tightness in her chest easing. "And I won't rush outside in the rain," she said. "I'll wait, or I'll call someone." Quang's mouth curved, tired but relieved. "Deal." They sat a while without needing more words. The rain softened into a quieter tapping on stone. The baby slept. Quang kept Linda's hand in his, and Linda let herself feel the simple safety of being waited for and being found.
Xin chào. Trong cái lạnh cắt da của vùng cao, Linda lủi thủi một mình trên nương sắn, quanh quẩn với đàn gà, đàn vịt, căn nhà sàn cũ kỹ. Lòng lúc nào cũng thấy cô đơn, mặc cảm và bị cảm giác bị bỏ rơi. Đúng lúc đó Quang trở về, lo lắng dặn cô không được đi vào những nơi vực sâu nguy hiểm và hứa sẽ bù đắp cho những thiếu thốn của cô. Vài ngày sau, Quang cùng người khiêng lên một chiếc tủ gỗ lớn, chắc chắn đặt giữa căn nhà sàn, giúp Linda lần đầu được treo gọn quần áo, chăn màn như một người thực sự có nhà. Anh xin nghỉ làm ở lại chăm sóc, cùng nấu ăn với cô, chể củi, trò chuyện mỗi tối. Chiếc tủ mới dần trở thành biểu tượng cho tương lai vững chắc và sợi dây gắn kết âm thầm giữa hai người. Mọi người hãy like, share và subscribe để ủng hộ giúp mình nhé.